We were just talking about this before we started recording here, but yeah, I do feel that to the degree that a lot of people know about Latin America, maybe they do know about Pinochet. Maybe they read Shock Doctrine. I read the Shock Doctrine. That was one of my first steps toward radicalization. I read it and haven't stopped being mad since. But at risk of kind of flattening people's view of Peru here or oversimplifying it, you would say that Fujimori is a Pinochet-like figure in Peru.
Oh, absolutely. They both committed genocides against native people, against workers. They allowed paramilitaries on their behalf to flourish. And they've sold out, both of them have sold out our countries to US and European transnational companies and established neoliberalism as the dominant, unquestionable economic system in the country, and allowing the national bourgeoisie in both Chile and Peru to flourish in collusion with the West at the expense of our people.
Yeah, I mean, really at a deep level down to this constitution, which was written in the Fujimori era, which is an issue of contention now in the same way that you still have the Pinochet era constitution in Chile. Fujimori came a little bit later. And so just to kind of set the stage for people who maybe don't know as much about Peru, he was elected and then he carried out a alto golpe, which is kind of the thing that Bolsonaro has threatened to do in the past in Brazil. Can you tell us a little bit about how he came to power and then how he became the dictator of Peru?
So around the time where Fujimori was elected was around the time that there was, I like to call it like a civil war, kind of. It was like the insurgency that lasted about like 20 something years, 25 years. In Peru, which was an insurgency of leftist groups. And so the most popular being Sendero Luminoso, also known as Shining Path, who were kind of like the ideological foundations of this idea of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. It was based on anti-revisionism. And, you know, there was another group, El Movimiento Revolucionario de Tupac Amaru, the Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Movement. Then there were those were two groups that engaged in more like in violent actions against the government, committing, you know, they'll call it acts of terrorism. In one instance, the MRTA kidnapped and held people hostage at the Japanese embassy. They used to kidnap executive directors. So there was a lot of political and left-wing turmoil in Peru at this time. And Alan Garcia, who was the center-left candidate, the Apristas, they consider themselves leftists, but you know they're like social democrats of the country, and they waged a war against Sendero Luminoso and the MRTA. Who, might I just add that Sendero Luminoso and MRTA were mostly there was a lot of mixed groups people there, but they were mostly indigenous people on the coast and in the mountains. And we'll get to talking about a little later why these indigenous people are so ready for the revolutionary struggle in Peru historically. But so they led a campaign against Sendero Luminoso and it didn't seem so successful. So the elites in Lima, they wanted to elect Fujimori because he was, one, obviously a neoliberal, and he seemed more likely to put an end to the so-called terrorism, put it to a stop. And I mean, I guess he did so, but by any means necessary. And so committing genocides, enabling a paramilitary group that also functioned as narco traffickers into the country and giving them extreme amounts of power. The CIA helped fund these organizations that ultimately murdered indigenous people. The Peruvian military acted with impunity. And there was there's a story of this family in Peru, and there were two brothers. They were indigenous, and the military came and asked them about Sendero Luminoso, and they said they didn't know anything. The military killed them because they had to be lying, because they were indigenous. And so that was the reality of the situation for indigenous people under Alberto Fujimori. So the second re-election, where you see so much violence committed by this man, you see so much radical change in the country, not for the best, even though he does seem like the strong man that's going to bring back the country to stability. And I think that that's something everyone always wants in no matter what part of the world, is that everyone wants to live in stability. They want economic, financial, political stability. They don't want to have to run into a street blowing up, even though sometimes some might say that that is what's necessary. I think generally people want stability. So he did seem to be able to give that more so than any other candidate at the time.
I guess the question becomes stability on whose terms?
Exactly. And There is some suspicions that his second reelection was actually committed through fraud and not that he was actually elected by the people. And that's something that's, kind of being discussed now, considering the fact that this coup, this self-coup, also gave way to the legitimization of the 1993 Constitution, which still governs Peru. And it's incredible to think about that fact that the guy who was behind this Constitution is sitting in prison for crimes against humanity right now.
Mm-hmm.
And his daughter is also under investigation for corruption, committing crimes. So the members of the Colina group also have been arrested, are also sitting in prison. And yet we still have to live under the political precedent they set.
Yeah, you would think this guy is bad enough to be in prison. I mean, this is a bad guy, but what is the legacy of this person? And Constitution being one part of the legacy. But also, you mentioned the role of the elites in this phenomenon of the Chicha press. How exactly was Fujimori able to kind of consolidate the press behind him at this time to really consolidate support for him?
It's very funny that you asked this question because my great-grandfather was actually a writer for a Peruvian magazine. The name slips me, but the reason why my family had to immigrate out of Peru was because of subliminal targeting of my great-grandfather being the editor of this paper and being very supportive of the left-wing insurgents. And so I think that is just a clear example of some of the things that other journalists, other members of the press had to live under, is this fear that you are going to be killed and targeted or arrested by the government. And so ultimately my family had to immigrate out of the country. And, in the 90s. And that is definitely one of the ways that Fujimori, like the strong man that he was, that really brought down the hammer, was to silence any supportive of the left-wing insurgents, any media that did. I think that there was a lot of government manipulation to divide the left and to make the right-wing and neoliberal right-wing stronger. And so we talked about this a little bit, but I definitely want to say that when it comes to like how the elites present themselves in Peru, there's a really good documentary that folks listening to this want to watch. It's called La Revolución y la Tierra. And it just talks about the historical and continued power of the criollo elite, people that were settlers and were colonizers in Peru, their families with generations of wealth, generations of land that was stolen from native people, and how today those very same people are at the top of industries. They're at the top of the markets. They own all the politicians. So like what the Fujimori Constitution allows this Congress to do in a moral incapacity clause to remove a president solely for the purpose that, and I would say that Manuel Merino, and I've said this before, represents the interests of the mining bourgeoisie, which are so influential and so powerful and have always been in Peru, that Vizcarra didn't necessarily defend their interests. He defended another sector of the bourgeoisie. And so that's how much power the Constitution Fujimori has put into that. Now we've already had 3 presidents that nobody's voted for. Nobody's voted for them as president. It was Kuczynski. We forget that in 2017, Kuczynski was elected as president just to get away from Keiko. And now we've had 3 presidents and nobody's elected them. And yet they're able to, and this Congress also, many of them haven't been elected by the people. Many have been elected with very unpopular support, very marginal support. And yet they get to make all these decisions. They get to have all this power in Peruvian politics and decide who's going to be the president for our people, for their sake of bourgeois interests.